Hey guys, tonight we walk into a room made of dust and moonlight, where the air feels cool in your lungs and every surface seems to remember a handprint. You can almost hear a soft rasp like fingernails on dried clay, as if someone nearby is still pressing reeds into wet tablets, trying to trap language before it evaporates. Our topic is the Sumerian texts that describe a planet-sized prison, and we are going to treat it the safe way. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Archaeology suggests a lot about how these people lived, but historians debate the bigger meanings. And you and I will keep our verbs polite, might, may, could suggests. Also, quick reality check. You probably would not survive a full day as a Sumerian scribe without complaining about your wrist, your eyes, and the fact that your paper is basically mud with commitment issues. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and your local time in the comments, because I love picturing this as a quiet little global campfire. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to the imagined work table, and the first thing you notice is not mystery but routine. Most historians agree that Sumerian writing begins in practical places. Grain sheep beer dates labour. It is not born as poetry, it is born as management. The evidence we do have points to early tablets functioning like receipts and lists, the kind of thing that makes a city run without constantly yelling across courtyards. You can picture it because you have lived the modern version. A spreadsheet, a time card, a checkout screen. Only here the screen is clay, the cursor is a reed stylus, and the save button is the sun baking everything into permanence. You imagine a scribe in a small room that smells faintly of wet earth and smoke. There is a bowl of water, a pile of soft clay lumps, and a flat board dusted with chaff, so nothing sticks. The scribe's hands are stained. His fingernails are packed with grit. He keeps looking toward the doorway, because this work is important, and important work always has somebody hovering. Most historians agree that scribes had specialized training and status. That part is solid ground, and yet as you stand in this scene, a careful reading might suggest something else, riding alongside the practicality, the feeling that writing itself is a form of enclosure. Because once something is pressed into clay, it does not easily come back out. That is where the mood starts to shift gently without the need for thunder. Archaeology suggests that many tablets were stored in temple or administrative contexts. And what's broadly accepted is that temples were not just religious in the modern sense. They were economic centres, storehouses, employers, distributors. A temple could be the place where your ration comes from and the place where your obligations are recorded. That's not conspiracy, that's organisation. Still, one interpretation is that the earliest writing systems function like a kind of net. They catch people not physically but socially. You become a name paired with a number, a worker assigned to a task, a debtor linked to a loan, a widow listed for barley, A teenager assigned to haul mud bricks. The tablet does not lie down to sleep. The tablet does not forget. The tablet simply sits there, hardening, saying, "You were here, you owed this, you received that, and you will be expected again." Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So let's keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground, Mesopotamian city life involves administration rations, labour organisation, and record keeping. Mist, the feeling that a record can behave like a wall. You pick up a tablet in your mind. It is palm-sized heavy for its size, like a stone that learned to speak. You tilt it, and the wedge marks catch the light. You cannot read them, not yet, but you recognise the human impulse behind them to control what is slippery: time, food, work, promises, people. And this is where your planet-sized prison idea begins to form, not as a flying saucer parked over the Euphrates, but as a quieter possibility. What if the first prison is not a building but a system? What if the bars are categories? What if the locks are ledgers? What if the guards are procedures? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that these systems arose to manage growing complexity, not to create misery for sport. A more cautious explanation could be that early states needed predictable accounting to prevent famine-reduced conflict and allocate labour fairly, at least by their standards. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see the lists, we can see the tallies, we can't always see how it felt to be inside them. And that is why the mood can turn cinematic with just a small twist of perspective. You picture the city at night. The sky is broad black blue crowded with stars. The river murmurs nearby, and the mud walls hold the day's warmth a little longer. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a baby cries and is soothed, somewhere a lamp is blown out. The city feels alive, and yet in the temple storeroom the tablets remain. Hundreds of them, thousands, stacked like bricks made of memory. What if for someone who cannot escape their obligations, this entire world feels like an enclosure that travels with them? Now you move closer to the phrase that gives tonight its eerie sparkle texts that describe a planet-sized prison. No tablets, as far as mainstream scholarship frames it, says, in plain modern English, "Welcome to the planet prison." We'll keep that solidly in the mist category. But it's possible that certain recurring images across myths and rituals can feel like confinement themes, especially to later readers hungry for cosmic drama. A careful reading might suggest that words for binding, enclosing, sealing and barring show up in contexts that are not only physical, but moral and cosmic. That's interpretation, and it's okay to sit with interpretation as long as we don't dress it up as a verdict. You can almost hear the stylus tapping click click press. The scribe pauses, flexing his fingers, and gives you a look that says you have no idea how annoying it is to carve bureaucracy into mud. You nod respectfully because you can relate. You have typed an email you didn't want to type. You have filled out a form that asked for the same information 3 times. You have stared at a required field that made you question reality. congratulations. You and a Sumerian scribe share a spiritual experience. Still, this isn't just about paperwork. Most historians agree. Sumerians also composed hymns, prayers, and mythic narratives, and archaeology suggests a rich intellectual world. Writing expands. It becomes story, and story can hold something bigger than barley. Story can hold fear and hope, law and longing. Story can hold a picture of the universe as a place with rules and boundaries. That is where planet size begins to make sense as mood rather than measurement. Imagine you step into a temple courtyard as dawn creeps in. The bricks are cool under your bare feet. The air smells like damp earth and ashes. Someone sweeps dust into a neat pile. Someone carries a jug of water on their hip. Most historians agree temples were central. The evidence we do have points to temples being places where offerings, labour and authority meet. One interpretation is that when a society places its centre of gravity in a sacred economic institution, daily life can start to orbit it. The temple becomes a sun. The city becomes a system of paths. The people become the moving parts. And what if to someone standing at the edge of that orbit, it feels like there is no outside at all? That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Historians still argue whether early Mesopotamian institutions were primarily exploitative engines or complex safety nets that also provided stability and redistribution. There's no full consensus because the tablets tell us what was counted, not always what was felt. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We can't climb into a person's nervous system from 5,000 years ago. We can only follow clues. Now, with your sleepy curiosity engaged, you begin looking for the first real door-closing clue in the language itself. Most historians agree that Sumerian scribes used specific terms for places, boundaries, and conditions, and that translation is tricky because words carry cultural weight. A careful reading might suggest that some phrases about being kept, held, or assigned can be read in more than one emotional register. On paper, it's administration. In a person's chest, it might be confinement. And if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a cinematic thought drifts in. What if the planet-sized prison isn't a cage in space? What if it is the feeling of living under a sky that watches, within a city that counts, inside a system that remembers? What if the bars are not metal, but obligation, not chain, but schedule, not lock, but ledger? You stand again at the work table. The clay is damp. The stylus waits. You can hear the fan in your room, that soft modern hum, mixing with the imagined whisper of reed on clay. And you realise the first section of the puzzle isn't a monster hiding behind the tablets. It's the very human urge to make life legible, to turn the world into marks, to turn people into entries, to turn the messy river of living into something you can stack neatly on a shelf. And you're not proving anything tonight, you're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and you take one more slow breath, because the next clue will not come with a trumpet. It will come like a quiet thought that lands and stays. You walk out into the morning heat of a young city, and the first thing you feel is scale. Not skyscraper scale, but human scale multiplied until it becomes a machine. Clay underfoot, sunlight bouncing off pale brick, the smell of river water, fish and smoke all braided together. Archaeology suggests that early southern Mesopotamian settlements grew into dense, organised urban spaces, and most historians agree that this growth required coordination that went far beyond one family's memory. You can almost hear it like a low, constant murmur, people bargaining, children calling donkeys, complaining about being donkeys, and somewhere in the middle of it all the steady rhythm of work being assigned. It's broadly accepted that cities like Uruk and other early centres developed systems for labour and distribution, and the evidence we do have points to institutions, especially temples and palaces, playing major roles in organising resources. On solid ground, this is how a city feeds itself without collapsing into daily chaos. But one interpretation is that once you build a system that can count people, you also build a system that can hold people. It's possible that the same tools used to prevent hunger can also become tools that limit choice. And what if the first planet-sized prison sensation begins right here in the way the city wraps around you like a schedule you didn't agree to? You drift through a marketplace that feels half like a modern farmer's market and half like a loading dock. Bundles of reeds, baskets of dates, jars of oil. A goat that looks deeply offended by the concept of commerce. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian economies were complex and mixed with households, temples and private trade all weaving together. No single story fits every person. Still, archaeology suggests that ration systems existed and that standardized distributions, including beer and grain, appear in administrative records. That's documented. The mist begins when you ask what it feels like to depend on a ration not just for food, but for permission to exist comfortably within the city. You pause near a doorway where someone is handing out measured portions. A scoop of barley here, a jar there, a small token, maybe a seal impression, maybe a name called out. It's all done with practiced speed because delays cause arguments, and arguments cause headaches, and nobody wants a headache before noon. A careful reading might suggest that such systems create a quiet boundary between those who belong inside the distribution network and those who live outside it. This is suggestive, not conclusive. A more cautious explanation could be that these systems were simply practical in a world of unpredictable harvests and heavy labour demands. But what if the line between practical and controlling is thinner than the clay rim of a cup? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that early states and institutions could provide stability as well as pressure. Scholars continue to debate how voluntary, coercive or negotiated these labour arrangements were in different places and periods. Historians still argue whether the rise of bureaucracy primarily improved communal resilience or primarily entrenched inequality. There's no full consensus, and tonight we're not choosing a single winner. We're following clues. Now you notice something almost funny in a sleepy way. The city's organisation is impressive, but it is also relentless. Everybody has a role. Everybody has a place to be. The canal needs dredging. The fields need planting. The walls need patching. The storerooms need guarding. You picture a foreman calling names, and the names sound less like individuals and more like parts in a list. It's broadly accepted that labour was organised for major building and irrigation projects, and archaeology suggests that maintaining canals and fields was critical to survival. So on solid ground you can't just opt out. If you do, the whole system dries up literally. The river does not care about your personal brand. But one interpretation is that when survival depends on collective infrastructure, freedom becomes something you negotiate, not something you simply have. It's possible that the city's greatest achievement, its ability to coordinate thousands of people, also creates the emotional texture of confinement. And what if, standing in this bustling place, you realise you can walk in a straight line for an hour and still remain inside the same web of obligations? You pass a schoolroom and the air changes. Less smoke, more dust, less shouting, more murmuring. Most historians agree that scribal training involved repetition and discipline, and archaeology suggests the existence of scribal schools where students learned signs and copying. You can picture the students' shoulders tense, pressing stylus marks into practice tablets. Someone whispers a mistake and gets corrected. Someone sighs. Someone daydreams. And you can almost see the teacher's stare, the ancient version of the modern "I'm waiting" look. Here is the documented anchor: writing and education exist as real structured practices. Here is the interpretation: a careful reading might suggest that literacy itself becomes a gate. If you can read, you can navigate the system. If you cannot, the system navigates you. That's not a conspiracy. That's how specialised knowledge works. And what if the prison isn't a wall but a language? You're locked outside of hearing it clack and click from the other side. You keep walking. The city is a rhythm, and you begin to sense how it holds its people in place without needing chains. Most historians agree that social hierarchy existed with roles, classes, and statuses. The evidence we do have points to differences in wealth and power. But the city doesn't feel like a single tyrant stomping around. It feels like an ecosystem. A rule here, a custom there, a schedule, a debt, a promise. You know how that works. You can leave one obligation and immediately bump into another like a pinball that keeps finding bumpers. Now the mystery theory side creeps in carefully, like a cat entering a room it pretends not to care about. A popular rumour claims that ancient Mesopotamian institutions were part of a hidden global program, a kind of deliberate containment system built by mysterious forces. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain dramatic magnetism, mostly because it turns paperwork into destiny. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded question underneath is, why do so many people, ancient and modern, describe systems as cages? What if the story is pointing at something else, not aliens or secret masters, but the human tendency to build structures that outgrow our comfort. To be clear, this is debated. Mainstream scholarship tends to explain these developments through population growth. Irrigation demands trade, and the evolution of political authority. That's the solid ground. The mist is the emotional metaphor, city as enclosure. Still, metaphors matter because they shape how people experience their lives. And a careful reading might suggest that some mythic language later on leans into images of nets, bonds, and decrees that cannot be escaped. You're not claiming it's literal, you're listening to the mood. You stop near the canal, where the water moves slowly, carrying silt like a thought you can't quite shake. Archaeology suggests irrigation and canals were essential, and most historians agree that control of water meant control of life. On solid ground, that's just geography and engineering. But one interpretation is that water management becomes a model for human management channel. It measure it direct. It punish those who disrupt the flow. It's possible that the city learns to treat people like the canal treats water, guiding them where they're needed. And what if the planet-sized prison is not stone or steel, but the logic of channels applied to everything? You let the thought settle. The city is not evil. The city is busy. The city is hungry. The city is proud. The city is tired. And you, as you move through it, begin to sense how the earliest urban life might feel both thrilling and claustrophobic at the same time. Most historians agree that cities created new opportunities, specialization, trade, art, learning. That's real. But it's possible that the same city also creates a new feeling that you live inside something larger than yourself that never truly stops. Historians still argue whether ordinary people experience this as oppression, protection, or simply the normal texture of life. That line, that debate, is one of the quiet hinges of tonight's theme. You are not proving anything. You are following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And as the sun climbs higher, you can almost feel the city's invisible roof. Not physical, but systemic, like a hand resting on your shoulder, guiding you to your assigned place. You take one more look at the canal, then at the walls, then at the moving crowd, and you imagine the whole thing from above. A dense pattern of streets and courtyards, storehouses, work sites, schools, temples, a network of movement that looks from a distance strangely like a diagram. And what if in the oldest stories pressed into clay, that diagram becomes the first sketch of a world that can hold you not by force but by function? You step into a courtyard where the air feels heavier, not from heat but from attention. People lower their voices without being told. Sandals scuff softer. A few heads tilt toward a doorway framed by clean brick and guarded calm. Most historians agree that in early Mesopotamian city, states' political authority and religious authority are tightly braided, and archaeology suggests temples and palaces sit near the center of power like twin pillars holding up the same roof. The evidence we do have points to leaders who rule with the language of the gods close at hand, not always as poetry, but as policy. You watch a procession pass, slow and careful, carrying offerings that look ordinary at first glance. Baskets, jars maybe, a small animal led by a rope, but the mood is unmistakable. This is not just shopping, this is relationship management with the cosmos. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian religion involves a pantheon of powerful deities tied to cities and forces of nature, and that rulers often present themselves as chosen, favoured, or sanctioned by these gods. Most historians agree that titles like Ensi and Lugal represent real political roles, though the exact balance of their power can vary by place and time. Solid ground, clear enough to walk on. Then comes the interpretation angle, and it arrives quietly. One interpretation is that gods in these texts and rituals sometimes function like a language for structure. A careful reading might suggest that when people describe a god assigning a fate, granting a kingship, or demanding a certain order, they are also describing how authority works on the ground. It's possible that the divine world becomes a mirror of human administration, a cosmic version of the same lists and roles that shape daily life. And what if when you hear a deity described as a lord or a judge, you're hearing a celestial job title, the heavenly equivalent of regional manager, but with better marketing? You drift closer to a group of officials. Their clothes are cleaner. Their posture says they have fewer blisters. One holds a seal, another holds a staff. Another holds a tablet because, of course, there's a tablet. Archaeology suggests that sealing practices and administrative control are real features of Mesopotamian governance. Most historians agree that cylinder seals and written documents help establish identity, authority, and ownership. That's the mainstream anchor, and it matters because it keeps the scene grounded in real systems. Now your imagination adds a soft cinematic layer, carefully labelled as possibility. What if the most effective prison is not a wall, but legitimacy? If everyone believes the order is sacred, the order becomes harder to question. A more cautious explanation could be that sacred framing creates social cohesion and shared meaning, not just compliance. To be clear, this is debated. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You listen to the language around you. It's full of blessing, decree, destiny, and duty. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where gods can be petitioned, offended, soothed, and praised. Still, a careful reading might suggest that this divine vocabulary also trains people to think in terms of assigned places. You do not just have a job, you have a portion. You do not just have a leader, you have a shepherd appointed by higher powers. You do not just follow rules, you participate in cosmic order. It's possible that this way of speaking makes the system feel as large as the sky itself. And what if the planet-sized prison idea is really the feeling that there is no corner of reality untouched by authority, because authority is painted onto the stars? You walk toward a shrine and notice something human and oddly comforting. People whisper for help with the same things people whisper for today: health, love, food, safety, a child, a good harvest. a neighbour who will stop being a neighbour. Most historians agree that prayer and ritual are woven into daily life. That's solid. Your sleepy brain supplies a light joke because it can't help itself. If you have ever begged your phone to charge faster, you already understand the vibe. Different shrine, same desperation. The scene shifts to the ruler's space, not necessarily a throne room in the movie sense, but a place that signals rank. The doorway is wider. The shade is deeper. The floor feels smoother. Most historians agree that rulers sponsor building projects, organize labour, and distribute resources, and that they often connect their authority to divine favour. Archaeology suggests that monumental construction and administrative architecture reflect concentrated power. What's broadly accepted is that kingship is not just personal charisma, it is an institution supported by scribes, officials, and ritual. Now the interpretation comes in with care. One interpretation is that the myths about gods deciding kingship function like a script for obedience. A careful reading might suggest that when a text says a god chooses a king, it may also be reminding everyone that resisting the king is resisting the order of things. This might support the idea that sacred language stabilizes political power. This is suggestive, not conclusive. A more cautious explanation could be that people genuinely experience the divine as real and intimate, and that kingship is framed religiously because religion is the shared language of meaning. Historians still argue whether early divine kingship primarily reflects sincere piety, pragmatic statecraft, or a blend that changes from city to city. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps the topic interesting without turning it into a single hidden truth. You notice how titles pile up like layers of clothing. King, shepherd, builder, judge, priestly patron. It's broadly accepted that Mesopotamian rulers cultivate images of care and strength, presenting themselves as protectors and providers. Yet it's possible that the same image also asks for submission. You think with a sleepy grin that modern leaders do this too, except now the sacred aura is called branding, and the temple hymns are called press releases. Now the mystery, theory, balance gets its careful portion. A popular rumour claims that these gods are not symbolic at all, that they are literal external beings who engineered social control and use kings as middle managers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it turns complex history into a simple drama, with villains, and simple dramas are easy to binge at 2 a.m. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the more grounded question underneath is worth keeping. Why do these texts sometimes describe divine assemblies' decrees and judgments in ways that feel almost bureaucratic? A careful reading might suggest that humans imagine the cosmos in the image of their institutions, or that institutions shape the way humans imagine the cosmos. Either way, it's possible that the divine court in myth reflects a real experience of being evaluated, assigned, and measured. You picture a scene that is gentle imagination clearly labelled. You stand in a vast hall that is not made of stone, but of expectation. Voices echo, not loud, just official. A decision is announced and it feels final. You are not harmed, you are simply placed. That is the quiet horror of systems when they do not need to shout. And what if the prison is this feeling of being placed by forces you cannot see, whether those forces are gods, in story or institutions in life? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The solid ground remains. Sumerian society blends religion and governance. Rulers use sacred framing and people live within organised institutions. The mist is the emotional interpretation and we keep it gentle. As you leave the courtyard, you catch one last detail, a scribe stepping aside to let an official pass, eyes lowered, tablet hugged to the chest. You think, with a third small joke, that even in ancient times, nobody wants to be the person who forgets the boss's title. It's safer to just keep adding honorifics until everyone falls asleep. You breathe in the warm air and you feel the theme deepen without needing any dramatic announcement. Most historians agree the gods and kings of Sumer are central to understanding their texts and their world. One interpretation is that this sacred hierarchy can make reality feel sealed from edge to edge, as if the whole planet is structured like a chain of command. And what if in the clay marks and ritual phrases, the first hint of a planet-sized prison is simply the sense that everything has an assigned place, including you? You follow a narrow street that gradually cools as the sun climbs, and it feels as if the city has a second temperature hidden inside it. In the shade between tall mud brick walls, your footsteps sound softer, and the air smells faintly of damp clay, old reed matting, and something like mineral dust. Most historians agree that Sumerian literature includes detailed descriptions of the underworld, often called Kur, and the evidence we do have points to a shared imagination of a below that is not simply a hole in the ground, but a structured realm with rules, gates, and authority. You don't need to believe it is literally under your feet to feel the power of it. Archaeology suggests these people live close to the soil, building with it, farming it, shaping it into bricks and bowls. So it makes sense that their stories would imagine depth as meaningful. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian underworld imagery tends to be bleak, in a quiet, resigned way, a place associated with dust, darkness, and a kind of dim routine rather than flaming punishment. That difference matters. It keeps tonight PG-13, and it keeps the history honest. A more cautious explanation could be that the underworld in these texts reflects grief, finality, and the human attempt to give death a map so it feels less like chaos. Still, one interpretation is that the underworld also works like a social diagram. A careful reading might suggest that the same society that organises fields, rations and titles also imagines the afterlife as an institution. There are thresholds, there are officials, there are decrees. There is a queen or ruler of the below in many traditions, and authority does not dissolve when you die, it simply relocates. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it's possible that the geography of the underworld is really a lesson in how order feels even when the lights go out. You slow your breathing, letting the modern fan hum in your room blend with the imagined hush of the alleyway, and you picture how a storyteller might speak this into the dark. You are not given a dramatic spiral into terror. You are given gates, multiple gates. Each one is a rule. Each one is a boundary. Most historians agree that certain Sumerian narratives describe a descent that involves passing through gates, and archaeology suggests that gates and walls are central features of city life and symbolism. So on solid ground, a gate is a familiar idea. It is where you are checked. It is where you are noticed. It is where you are either allowed or not allowed. Now the interpretation angle arrives gently. One interpretation is that the underworld gates echo real experiences of controlled access in life. Temple courtyards, storerooms, workshops, administrative spaces. A careful reading might suggest that the story is not only about death, but about the feeling of being processed. Step here, remove this, wait, speak when spoken to. It's possible the underworld becomes a mirror of the city's deepest habits. And what if below is less a physical location than a policy, the ultimate regulation that applies to everyone eventually? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. People tell stories for many reasons: comfort, fear management, moral reflection, ritual, meaning. The underworld can be all of those without being a code for bureaucracy. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the motifs. We don't fully know how each listener 5,000 years ago felt them in their chest. You walk past a small courtyard where someone kneads dough, and the simple domestic scene makes the underworld imagery feel even more personal. Because the underworld in these traditions is not a distant abstract heaven, it is part of the same world, like the city's shadow. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cosmology often imagines layered regions, sky above earth, in the middle, a realm below. The evidence we do have points to a cosmos with boundaries, not a formless blur. That's the mainstream anchor, and it matters for tonight's theme, because boundaries are where a prison feeling can begin, even if nobody calls it that. Now the cinematic what-if mood slips in carefully, labelled as imagination. What if you stand at one of those underworld gates, not scared, just tired, like you are waiting at a late-night office building security desk. The guard is not angry, the guard is professional. The guard asks for your name, your status, your reason, and you realize that even in myth the universe is staffed. It's a calm, unsettling thought, because a staffed universe implies administration, and administration implies rules. You allow yourself a small, sleepy joke, because you need one to keep the vibe human. If the underworld has multiple gates, you just know there is at least one gate that says, please take a number, and the number dispenser is naturally out of numbers. You wait anyway. A careful reading might suggest that underworld stories teach you something about permanence, not in the sense of eternal torment, but in the sense that some decisions cannot be undone. That is a very human concern. You can almost feel the storyteller guiding your mind toward acceptance. The world has a shape, and not all doors open both ways. Still, interpretation has limits. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We can't claim every underworld image is a deliberate social critique. It might simply be a way to describe the unknown with the most familiar architecture available. Historians still argue whether these underworld descriptions reflect actual ritual practices and beliefs about death, or whether they function mainly as literary and symbolic frameworks that vary over time and place. There's no full consensus, and tonight that uncertainty is not a flaw. It's the soft space where imagination can breathe without pretending to be fact. Now for the quirky or fringe tidbit, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that ancient underworld descriptions are not symbolic at all, but are literal maps of hidden caverns, underground cities, or even an inner world beneath the surface. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it turns metaphor into geography, and geography feels solvable. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful, not because it proves anything, but because it highlights how vivid these texts can be. The language is strong enough that later readers sometimes want it to be literal. A more cautious explanation could be that vivid language is simply what good storytelling does. It gives the mind a place to stand, even when the subject is something you cannot test. And the underworld is the ultimate untestable topic for an ancient audience. So the story gives you gates, dust rulers, and procedures, not to trap you, but to make the unknown feel narratable. You keep walking and you notice how often the underworld is described as orderly, even if it's gloomy. That detail is important for the planet-sized prison mood. An orderly underworld suggests a universe where authority is not a temporary human invention, but a cosmic pattern. One interpretation is that this kind of cosmology can make life feel enclosed from every angle above, below, and all around. A careful reading might suggest that when your myths place officials at the borders of reality, you are being trained to think of borders as natural. Here comes your second light joke, because your brain insists on staying slightly cheeky. If the underworld is where everyone ends up, it is basically the most inclusive community ever. 0 membership fees, questionable lighting, and the dress code is unfortunately dusty. Then you soften the humour and let the cinematic possibility settle. What if the underworld is not a threat but a clue about how people experience systems? You are alive, you have obligations, you die, you have gates. The rules change, but the sensation of being processed remains. That might support the idea that the underworld reflects the lived reality of structured society. This raises the possibility that prison language, when it appears in later interpretations, is less about a literal cage and more about the feeling that reality itself is layered with permissions and denials. Let me rephrase that more carefully again. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that Sumerian underworld imagery is part of a broader ancient Near Eastern tradition with unique local features, and archaeology suggests their daily life makes such imagery emotionally resonant. The solid ground is the texts and the patterns. The mist is the big conclusion, and we keep it as mist. You reach a spot where the alley opens into sunlight and the warmth feels almost like permission. You look down at your hands in your imagination as if you might find dust there, and you think about how these stories teach you to live inside the boundaries without screaming, not because it's pleasant, but because it's reality. And what if that is the quiet heart of the planet-sized prison idea? Not a cosmic sentence handed down by hidden beings, but the human recognition that existence comes with gates. And the gates do not always explain themselves. Your breathing slows, the city continues, the sky stays wide, and somewhere in the mind's underworld, a gate closes with a sound that is not violent, just final, like a softly latched door. You reach a place where the city's noise seems to fold itself away, as if sound knows it is approaching a boundary. The street narrows, then bends, and suddenly you're in front of a gate that does not look dramatic in a movie sense, but looks important in a human sense. Its bricks are cleaner. Its threshold is worn smooth by years of feet. The wooden doors are thick, patched, and darkened by sun and touch. Archaeology suggests that city walls and gates are practical features of Mesopotamian urban life, and most historians agree they serve multiple roles at once: defense, regulation of movement, and a visible symbol of where inside ends and outside begins. You stand close enough to smell the timber, that warm, dry scent mixed with tar or resin and a faint note of dust. You can almost hear the hardware, the simple weight of bars and pivots. The evidence we do have points to gates being managed, spaces, staff spaces, and in many cities, taxed spaces. Even if you never pay with coins, you pay with attention. Someone watches, someone asks where you are going, someone decides if your bundle looks suspicious, someone decides if you belong. This is the mainstream anchor, solid ground. People build gates because gates solve problems. They keep animals from wandering in, they keep enemies from rushing in, they keep goods from slipping out without being noticed. A more cautious explanation could be that gates are simply technology for survival. And yet one interpretation is that the gate becomes an emotional technology too. A careful reading might suggest that when a society gets used to thresholds, it begins to imagine the entire world as a series of thresholds. It's possible that the language of sealed, barred, closed, opened, and permitted creeps into everything. Law, ritual, identity, even the stories told at night. You rest your palm on the brick and feel it holding the day's heat. What's broadly accepted is that the Sumerian world is full of boundaries, not only physical but social. Household boundaries, temple boundaries, class boundaries. And because humans love to make metaphors out of whatever is in front of them, the boundary becomes a way to talk about fate. A careful reading might suggest that closed can mean more than a door. It can mean a path, a future, a forgiveness, a chance. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We can't claim every boundary word is secretly a prison code. Sometimes a door is a door. Sometimes a seal is just a seal. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see the habit of boundary making. We can't always see the private feelings it creates. You watch the gatekeepers, and they are not monsters. They are workers. One has a staff. One has a small token or seal. One has the posture of someone who has said, "State your business" so many times, it has become a lullaby. Your brain offers a light joke to keep you sleepy. If you think modern security lines are slow, imagine trying to explain your carry-on is a goat, and the goat is definitely not exceeding the liquid limit, because it is regrettably the liquid. Most historians agree that seals and sealing practices become important in administration, and archaeology suggests cylinder seals are used to mark ownership and authority, rolling a miniature image across clay like a signature that also tells a story. That is documented. The seal is a tiny world of symbols, and it functions like access control. It says, this jar is mine, this door is mine, this tablet is official, this agreement is binding. One interpretation is that the seal does not merely record reality, it shapes it. A careful reading might suggest that when a seal impression is pressed into clay, it turns a human promise into an object that can outlast a mood. And that is where the planet-sized prison mood can sharpen gently without claiming literal cosmic walls. It's possible that a society saturated with seals and thresholds begins to experience life as something you move through only by permission. Not always permission from a cruel person, sometimes permission from a system. The evidence we do have points to legal and administrative frameworks that define obligations and ownership. The more cautious explanation is that these frameworks reduce conflict by making expectations clear. But what if the same clarity also feels like a cage to someone who has nothing to trade but their own labour? You imagine the moment a gate closes, not slamming, just closing. The bar slides into place with a dull wooden sound, and that sound is the oldest kind of punctuation. Sentence ends, paragraph ends, day ends. Options narrow. You don't need to add drama. The gate does the work. A careful reading might suggest that this is why gate language appears so naturally in myth and ritual. Gates are the most obvious symbol of enforced boundaries, and humans tend to reuse the best symbols. Now you move from the gate into the law of the city, and it feels like another kind of wall. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia develops legal traditions and formalized agreements, and while the details shift across centuries, the evidence we do have points to contracts, property rules, and social expectations that are written down and enforced. This is where the narrative gets very unromantic in a charming way. You can almost hear the ancient version of fine print whispering, by receiving one jar of beer, you agree to everything forever. Your second light joke lands softly. The first lawyer is probably just a scribe who got tired of people saying, I don't remember promising, that while holding the tablet that literally says they promised that. One interpretation is that legal language can feel like sealing language. A careful reading might suggest that when a contract is recorded, it creates a boundary around behaviour. You can still act, but certain actions now have consequences that follow you. It's possible that the prison theme begins to look less like a dungeon and more like a web of binding commitments. This might support the idea that sealed fate is not just poetic, but rooted in lived experience of written obligations. Historians still argue whether ordinary people viewed these legal structures as protection oppression, or simply the air they breathed, because the tablets preserve outcomes and procedures more reliably than feelings. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It keeps us honest. It keeps the solid ground separate from the mist. Now, the mystery side enters with careful labelling. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient boundary descriptions hint at something cosmic, that the seals and bars in myth are references to a literal enclosure around the world, a kind of vast containment system. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a slow hypnotic pull, because it turns ordinary gates into echoes of a larger gate you can't see. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still help us ask a calmer question: why do so many stories use boundary imagery when describing the structure of reality? A more cautious explanation could be that humans reach for familiar architecture to describe the unknown. We live with doors, so we imagine the universe has doors. You picture as gentle imagination a horizon that feels like a rim, not a flat earth, not a science fiction dome, just a sensation that the world is bordered by rules you did not write. You walk toward that rim and notice invisible signage, not written in English, but felt in the body. Stop. Turn back. Authorized personnel only. You smile sleepily at your third light joke, because even cosmic boundaries deserve humour. Somewhere out there, the universe's complaint department is definitely closed on weekends, and the hours are posted in a script nobody can read. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian texts use rich symbolism, and that gates and seals are central in real life and in narrative. The evidence we do have points to walls, thresholds, and administrative control being part of the lived environment. The interpreted layer is the emotional resonance gates as a way to feel the limits of life. The imagined layer is the cinematic thought: what if the biggest boundary is simply the one you can't see? You step away from the gate and listen again to the city. Beyond this point, there are other thresholds, smaller ones: doorways into workshops, curtains into shrines, storeroom locks, family courtyards. Each one is a quiet decision about who belongs. Archaeology suggests these spaces are real and structured, and most historians agree that access and status shape daily movement. One interpretation is that the planet-sized prison is not a single structure, but a pattern of nested boundaries: brick, wood, seal, word, law. It's possible that the feeling of being enclosed builds not from one wall, but from many small permissions stacked together. You inhale the dusty warmth, and you let the thoughts settle without forcing it to be more than it is. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. The gate stands behind you, calm and heavy, and the world ahead feels wide, but also organized like a map drawn by someone who loves borders. You slip into a quieter kind of room, the kind where stories are told with lowered voices, because the names inside the story feel heavy. The lamplight wobbles on plaster. Someone stirs a pot, and the smell of onions and smoke drifts through, warm and ordinary. Most historians agree that Sumerian religion includes councils of gods, gatherings where divine figures are imagined to deliberate, decide, and distribute authority. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where the cosmos is not a lonely throne, but a crowded meeting. And in that crowded meeting, you hear a name that later becomes famous in the modern imagination, the Anunnaki. On solid ground, what's broadly accepted is that the word appears in Mesopotamian tradition as a group of deities often described as important gods, sometimes linked to the underworld in later contexts, and sometimes treated more broadly as a high-ranking divine assembly. The details shift across languages and eras, which is normal for ancient traditions that span many centuries. Archaeology suggests a living religious culture, not a single fixed script. Still, you can feel why the Anunnaki catch attention. A group name implies an organization. An organization implies roles. Roles imply hierarchy. And hierarchy in a story about a world that might feel sealed starts to sound like management at the cosmic level. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki function like narrative machinery, not machines made of metal, but story tools that help explain how decisions happen. A careful reading might suggest that when a text imagines God's convening, it offers listeners a familiar shape. Problems are discussed, verdicts are issued, responsibilities are assigned. It's possible that divine councils mirror the human councils that run the city, the kind where elders, officials, or rulers consult, argue, and decide what happens next. And what if the story is pointing at something else, not extraterrestrials or secret prisons, but the human habit of imagining the universe using the same structure as the society you live in? You picture the scene as gentle imagination clearly framed as possibility. You stand at the edge of a divine hall. The walls are not walls exactly, more like boundaries made of authority. The air feels still like a room waiting for someone important to speak. Figures sit in a circle, not necessarily human-shaped in a literal sense, but the story gives them voices, and the voices have that familiar tone of people who believe they are in charge. Not shouting, just certain. Now, before the mind runs away with itself, you keep the solid ground close. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian myths and hymns often describe gods assigning destinies, granting kingship, or defining the order of things. That is a mainstream anchor. It's also where the prison feeling can sneak in as interpretation, because if destiny is assigned in a meeting, you are not invited to life, can feel like you are living inside someone else's plan. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories give people meaning and comfort, helping them feel the world is intelligible rather than random. Still, the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can read the images of councils and decrees. We cannot fully know whether every listener felt comforted, constrained, or both. You notice a small detail in the way these divine groups are described, at least as the tradition is generally understood. They are not always portrayed as single-minded. Sometimes there's tension shifting alliances, competing priorities. It's broadly accepted that ancient myth often uses conflict among gods to explain conflict in the world. One interpretation is that the divine council becomes a safe stage for human anxieties about authority. It's possible that a person who has watched officials make decisions that affect their food labour or family can hear the same pattern in the sky. And what if the planet-sized prison sensation is really the feeling that decisions that shape your life are always being made somewhere else by someone else? Whether that someone is a temple institution, a ruler, or a mythic assembly. Your sleepy brain offers the first light joke because it cannot resist. If the gods have councils, you just know there is a scribe god taking minutes, and you just know the minutes read something like Item 1 fate, Item 2 more fate, Item 3 somebody forgot to bring the offerings again. Even the divine world apparently runs on agendas. Now comes an important safety step. There is a modern fringe interpretation that treats the Anunnaki as literal non-human beings who engineered humanity and set up a world-scale containment system. A fringe idea proposes that ancient texts are coded reports of a planetary prison run by these beings, and that myth is simply history in disguise. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular in certain corners because it offers a clean, dramatic explanation for messy realities. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the careful question becomes, what in the texts and in the human experience makes people want that reading? A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki as a named group feel like a ready-made cast for modern science fiction. A group name is easy to grab. A council is easy to turn into a command centre. And ancient language is often poetic, layered and incomplete in ways that invite imaginative reconstruction. That does not make the reconstruction false by definition, but it does mean the evidence is thin for literal claims. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki label always points to a consistent group across time, or whether it shifts in meaning as traditions move between Sumerian and later Mesopotamian cultures, and as underworld and heavenly roles blur in different texts. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of why the topic can feel misty without needing to become misleading. You keep walking through the story and you notice how the Anunnaki, in the broad way they are imagined, can act like a bridge between the human world and the cosmic world. They are a way to say there is a structure above you and it has many parts. One interpretation is that this reinforces the feeling that reality has layers of authority stacked above ordinary life. It's possible that when you imagine a divine assembly, you also imagine that there is no empty space in the universe. Every corner has a supervisor. Every wind has a department. Every river has a manager. Second light joke. Soft and sleepy. The cosmos is basically a giant office, except the dress code is radiant. The performance reviews are called omens, and the coffee breaks are unfortunately not guaranteed. Now you try a different angle, more mainstream and more human. Most historians agree that myth often serves social purposes. It legitimizes kingship, explains natural cycles and teaches values. The evidence we do have points to myth being used in ritual and civic identity, not only for entertainment. One interpretation is that divine councils model the ideal, or at least the expected way decisions should be made, not randomly, but through deliberation, hierarchy, and established roles. This might support the idea that the Anunnaki are less about secret jailers and more about how a society imagines order. And what if the story is pointing at something else again? Something quietly psychological? What if the planet-sized prison is the sensation that order is everywhere, that everything has a role, and that even the gods are part of a system? In that reading, the Anunnaki are not wardens in a cage. They are gears in a cosmic machine, a metaphor for inevitability. That's interpretation, not a verdict. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You picture a final scene as calm imagination. The divine council disperses, not with drama, just with decisions. The hall empties, the air feels lighter, but the decisions remain like tablets that have already dried. You step outside and look up at the sky, and it seems vast but also organised, as if it has invisible shelves. And what if the strangest part is not the idea of gods at all, but the idea that even the divine realm is bureaucratic, like reality itself cannot help but make lists? Third Light Joke whispered, "Somewhere a god is definitely saying, per my last tablet," and the universe sighs. You let the image fade into the warm dark of the room, and you keep the tone honest. The Anunnaki on solid ground belong to a rich tapestry of Mesopotamian tradition that evolves over time. The prison idea, when it appears, lives mostly in interpretation and modern reimagining. And tonight you are not proving anything. You are following clues and letting the clues stay the size they are without forcing them into a single answer. You wander into a smaller, tighter world where the air smells like sweat reeds and the sharp tang of old grain. The streets here feel less ceremonial and more practical, like the city's backstage. A woman squats beside a basket, sorting something you can't name. A man lifts a jar and winces because gravity has never been impressed by human ambition. Most historians agree that debt loans and forms of servitude exist in ancient Mesopotamia, and the evidence we do have points to economic pressures shaping real lives, not just myths. Archaeology suggests complex households and institutions managing resources, which means people are always balancing need against obligation. This is where the theme of bondage lands with a very grounded thud, like a sack of barley hitting the floor. Solid ground first. What's broadly accepted is that people borrow people, owe people work, and sometimes those arrangements become harsh. A careful reading might suggest that language of binding and release is often economic before it is cosmic. It's possible that when later listeners imagine a planet-sized prison, they're hearing echoes of something more ordinary and more constant, the feeling of being trapped by what you owe. You stand near a small doorway where an agreement is being spoken aloud. The scribe is there naturally because nothing becomes official until someone scratches it into clay. The borrower looks nervous. The lender looks calm, which is the universal facial expression of being owed something. Most historians agree that written contracts appear in Mesopotamian contexts covering loans, labour and property, And the evidence we do have points to a legal culture that records obligations. That's mainstream. It's also deeply human. If you have ever signed something without reading the entire thing, you understand the ancient vibe. The stylus is just a pen with more attitude. One interpretation is that debt systems create a particular kind of enclosure. You are not locked behind a gate, but your future is partially pre-spent. A careful reading might suggest that bound language in some contexts is about being tied to a creditor, tied to a household, tied to a work obligation. This is suggestive, not conclusive, because every society has a range of experiences, and not every contract is a trap. A more cautious explanation could be that credit helps people survive bad harvests, start trade, and stabilize households. Still, it's possible that credit can also become a net, especially for those with little margin. Historians still argue whether debt-related servitude in early Mesopotamia should be understood primarily as temporary social support mechanisms that sometimes went wrong, or as systemic pressures that entrenched inequality over time. There's no full consensus because the tablets preserve transactions more than they preserve tears. You walk past a work yard where people are shaping bricks. The rhythm is steady. Press, lift, set. Press, lift, set. Archaeology suggests mud brick construction is central to Mesopotamian cities, and most historians agree that large projects require organised labour, solid ground again. But now you let the interpretation breathe. One interpretation is that repetitive labour, when paired with obligation, can feel like a kind of living captivity, even if no guard stands over you with a weapon. A careful reading might suggest that the real prison is not physical confinement, but the shrinking of choices. It's possible that a person's world becomes as small as the task in front of them. Your first light joke arrives softly because you need a little humour to keep this from feeling bleak. If you think your job has repetitive tasks, imagine having to invent brick making from scratch, then doing it forever while also pretending it's spiritually uplifting. The bricks do not clap for you. The bricks simply become more bricks. Now you step into the language itself, because language is where the mystery theory crowd often hangs out, looking for hidden doors. Most historians agree that translating ancient texts involves uncertainty, because words carry meaning shaped by culture, context, and time. The evidence we do have points to terms that can be read in multiple ways depending on where they appear. One interpretation is that when a text uses imagery of binding nets or restraint, it might be reflecting economic realities. Another interpretation is that it might be reflecting ritual or moral metaphors. It's possible that both are true at different moments. And what if the power of these texts is that they let one kind of bondage echo inside another? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not going to claim a single word always means the same thing everywhere. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But it is reasonable to notice that economic pressure is a reliable source of captivity feelings, ancient or modern. Now the mystery theory portion arrives carefully framed and clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that ancient debt language is actually coded, cosmic language, that when texts speak of being bound, They are secretly describing humanity being bound to a planetary prison system. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's emotionally compelling because it turns personal struggle into epic drama. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a calmer question: why do people want their suffering to have a grand explanation? Sometimes a grand explanation feels less lonely than a simple one. A more cautious explanation could be that grand explanations are easier to share and remember, especially online, while the everyday truth is quieter debt can trap people and societies, build rules around debt, and those rules can feel like a cage. You don't need aliens to make a person feel cornered by obligation. You just need a bad harvest and a contract. Second light joke, sleepy and modern. If you want to time travel, don't bring a smartphone. Bring a calculator, because you are going to be doing Bali math. And Bali math does not care about your feelings. You pause by a canal, watching water move slowly. It looks free, but it follows the channel. That feels like the perfect metaphor. So you use it carefully. Most historians agree canals are engineered to direct water, and archaeology suggests their maintenance is essential. One interpretation is that canal logic seeps into social logic: direct measure, punish disruption, reward compliance. It's possible that debt is the canal of human time, directing a person's labour into a creditor's storehouse. And what if the planet-sized prison is simply the experience of being directed, not by a chain, but by arithmetic? Historians still argue whether these systems were experienced as normal reciprocity within a tight-knit economy, or as heavy pressure that limited mobility and autonomy, especially for vulnerable groups. There's no full consensus, and that debate is your reminder to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you let the camera of imagination focus on one person, because systems feel abstract until you see hands. You picture someone in a small room lit by a lamp, counting a small pile of grain. The pile is not enough. They know it. Their shoulders droop and the air around them feels tight. A scribe might arrive tomorrow. A creditor might arrive tomorrow. It's possible that the feeling of prison begins in moments like this, where the future feels narrowed into a corridor. That's gentle imagination, but it is rooted in a documented reality. Scarcity pressures exist. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because it matters. That's a possibility, not a certainty about any specific person. We cannot point to a tablet and claim we know exactly how someone felt. But the evidence we do have points to economic structures that can produce such feelings. Third light joke. Soft and human. In the ancient world, adulting is basically just carrying heavy things and owing somebody something which is depressing, until you realise nothing has changed, except now the heavy thing is called emails. You lift your head and look at the city again, and you feel the theme deepen in a new way. Not cosmic, not sensational, just quietly sharp. Most historians agree Sumerian society is complex, organised and deeply tied to resource management. One interpretation is that debt and obligation can make the world feel enclosed from the inside out, like a prison that lives in your calendar and your stomach. And what if, when later readers imagine a planet-sized prison in ancient texts, they're hearing the oldest, most universal prison language of all I owe, therefore I cannot leave. You drift into a storeroom where the air feels cooler, not because it is underground, but because it is crowded with sealed jars and stacked baskets that keep their own quiet. The smell is a mix of grain dust, dried herbs, and something yeasty that makes you think of bread and beer at the same time. Most historians agree that ration distributions are a documented feature of Mesopotamian administrative life, and archaeology suggests that standardized measures and storage practices are central to managing large communities. The evidence we do have points to a world where comfort is portioned, not improvised. A worker steps forward and receives a measured amount. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. Systems are often most powerful when they feel normal. What's broadly accepted is that rations can include grain oil and often beer, and that these distributions help sustain labour forces and households. Solid ground. You can hear the scratch of a stylus nearby because someone is recording the exchange. Someone always is. One interpretation is that rationing creates controlled comfort. It's possible that when your food and drink arrive by allocation, your sense of security becomes tied to your position in the system. A careful reading might suggest that reward and ration can blur. In practice, you work, you receive. That can be fair and stabilizing. A more cautious explanation could be that ration systems prevent starvation and reduce conflict by making distribution predictable. Still, what if the sweetness of predictability also becomes the lock, because leaving the system means losing the portion? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Not every ration is a leash. Sometimes it is simply support. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Yet the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see what was measured. We can't always see the emotional trade-off people felt between belonging and independence. You watch the beer being poured or handed out, and it looks more like everyday nutrition than modern party fuel. Most historians agree that beer in ancient Mesopotamia is often part of daily diet and labour compensation, and archaeology suggests brewing and grain processing are common. What's broadly accepted is that beer is a staple, not just a treat. That detail is charming and very human. It also makes the control question more interesting. When the system provides your daily calories, it doesn't need chains, it needs ledgers. Your first light joke slips in warm and sleepy. If you think office snacks are a form of employee retention, imagine a world where the snack is literally your dinner and the retention strategy is called survival. Now you notice how precise everything is. Measures, containers, seals. The evidence we do have points to standardized units and administrative tracking. Archaeology suggests that weights, measures, and storage vessels are part of the infrastructure of early complex societies. On solid ground, that's efficiency. On misty ground, one interpretation is that precision is a kind of quiet power. A careful reading might suggest that when a society becomes obsessed with measuring, it also becomes capable of defining what is enough for you, and enough can be a ceiling as well as a floor. It's possible that controlled comfort becomes an emotional boundary. You are not starving, but you are also not free to wander far from the place where your portion is calculated. And what if the planet-sized prison idea at this stage is really about a world where comfort is administered like a permission slip? Historians still argue whether these ration systems should be viewed primarily as evidence of centralized care and redistribution, or as evidence of dependence and hierarchy that limited autonomy for many workers. There's no full consensus, and the debate is a reminder that the same system can feel different depending on where you stand in it. You wander towards the scribal corner and you see the tablets stacked like small loaves of hardened thought. A scribe checks a seal impression, then marks a line. The motion is practiced, almost soothing. Press, glance, record. Press, glance, record. Most historians agree scribes play an essential role in administration, and the evidence we do have points to writing being deeply entangled with economy. That's mainstream. Now the interpretation. One interpretation is that the act of recording turns living exchange into fixed obligation. A careful reading might suggest that the tablet is not just memory, but a tool that can be used to enforce memory. It's possible that this is the moment when comfort becomes conditional. Second light joke, because the vibe needs a wink. The ancient terms and conditions are not a pop-up you ignore. They are literally a brick that can be handed to a judge. Now the mystery side enters with gentle labelling. A fringe idea proposes that ancient ration systems are evidence of a hidden program, that humanity was deliberately kept on controlled provisions by non-human overseers, and that the texts preserve the plan in plain sight. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it stays popular because it turns a complicated economy into a simple prison narrative. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a calmer question: why does rationing, even when practical, feel symbolically like captivity? The answer might be emotional rather than cosmic. Being fed by an institution can feel like safety and dependence at the same time. A more cautious explanation could be that these systems grow from environmental challenges. Irrigation agriculture can produce abundance, but it also produces vulnerability. Floods, droughts, salinization, shifting river channels. In such conditions, centralized storage and distribution can be survival strategy. That's the solid ground. The mist is the feeling if survival is distributed by someone else, your life can feel held in their hand. You step outside the storeroom into sunlight, and the brightness makes your eyes squint. You hear laughter in the distance. Someone is singing softly. The world is not all control. Most historians agree that communities celebrate, worship, marry, raise children, and enjoy small pleasures. Archaeology suggests evidence of craft art and domestic life alongside bureaucracy. This matters because a prison metaphor should not flatten life into misery. The city can be structured and still be alive. But what if that liveliness is part of the system's genius? Controlled comfort does not have to feel like a cage. It can feel like normal life. It can feel like belonging. It can feel like this is just how the world is. A careful reading might suggest that the most enduring enclosures are the ones you stop noticing. It's possible that people accept boundaries more easily when their basic needs are met within those boundaries. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Not every acceptance is coerced. Sometimes people truly prefer stability. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the pattern is interesting. The evidence we do have points to rationing and recording being central. One interpretation is that the combination creates a quiet web. You receive, you owe. You are counted, you belong. You belong, you comply. Third Light Joke whispered, "The ancient world's loyalty program is simple. Collect enough seal impressions and you earn one free existential crisis." Now you let the cinematic what-if mood arrive softly. What if you zoom out from the storeroom and see it as a heart pumping portions through the city's veins? The jars are not just food, they are the city's way of keeping people in motion, in place, in time. And what if the planet-sized prison is not a cage in the sky, but a world where comfort itself is routed through a system that can close a valve whenever it wants? Historians still argue whether that valve was experienced as benevolent stewardship, routine administration, or pressure, because again, the records preserve quantities more than feelings. There's no full consensus. That uncertainty is your soft blanket tonight. It lets the story stay honest and still feel mysterious. You walk on, leaving the cool storeroom behind, and the smell of grain dust fades. The city noise returns, and you realise the clue in this section is not a hidden alien signature. It is something quieter and more human, the idea that comfort can be administered, and administered comfort can feel like both shelter and restraint depending on the day. You step into the open air where the heat still clings to the bricks, but the sky is beginning to look like a darker kind of parchment. The city quiets in the way a room quiets when someone turns down the music. Above you, stars appear one by one, not rushing, not performing, simply arriving on schedule like they have done for longer than any temple has stood. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians paid close attention to the sky tracking cycles of the moon, the sun, and visible planets, and archaeology suggests that careful observation helps shape calendars and ritual timing. The evidence we do have points to a world where time is not an abstract concept, but a tool you hold up to the heavens. You feel it immediately, that shift from earthly systems to sky systems, because the sky is the biggest system anyone can look at without building anything. What's broadly accepted is that lunar months and seasonal markers help organise agriculture festivals and civic life. If you need to plant, harvest and distribute food, you need timing that most people can agree on. A more cautious explanation could be that calendars begin as survival math, not mystical prophecy. Still, one interpretation is that once you start treating the sky like a schedule, the sky begins to feel like a ceiling. A careful reading might suggest that predictable cycles can feel comforting, but they can also feel like a rule you cannot negotiate with. You stand on a rooftop and watch a thin crescent moon hang low, looking sharp enough to slice paper. Somewhere nearby, someone points and murmurs. Another person nods. A scribe, of course, is ready to record, because nothing is real until it can be filed. Most historians agree that scribes and scholars in Mesopotamian cultures developed sophisticated methods of observation and record keeping, and the evidence we do have points to long traditions of interpreting celestial events as meaningful. On solid ground, you are seeing early science mixed with cultural meaning, not a modern lab, but not mere superstition either. Now the interpreted layer comes in carefully signposted. One interpretation is that omen reading is a way to manage uncertainty. If the river floods, if the crops fail, if a ruler dies, people want patterns that make chaos feel speakable. A careful reading might suggest that the sky becomes a language for anxiety and hope because the sky is stable enough to carry meaning. It's possible that a person who feels trapped by earthly obligations looks upward and finds a different kind of authority. And what if the authority above feels even harder to escape because you cannot walk away from the sky? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that celestial observation has practical aspects and cultural aspects, and that interpretations vary by place, period, and purpose. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the mood is real because humans are very good at turning patterns into messages. Your first light joke drifts in softly because your modern brain cannot resist. Imagine explaining to someone in this city that you missed a meeting because Mercury looked weird. They would probably nod like, fair honestly, Mercury has been acting up all week. You watch a planet that does not twinkle the way stars do, steady and bright. The evidence we do have points to ancient awareness of the wandering nature of planets, their slow shifting against the fixed background of stars. What's broadly accepted is that such movements are tracked and later systematized in detailed traditions. Archaeology suggests that temples and scholarly circles preserve and transmit specialized knowledge, solid ground again. And now the prison metaphor gains a new angle. One interpretation is that once time is anchored to the sky, your life becomes anchored too. You do not just work when you want, you work when the season says, you celebrate when the calendar says, you fear when the omen says. A careful reading might suggest that fate language grows around predictable skies, not because the sky forces fate, but because humans see repeating cycles and begin to imagine that everything else must also be cyclical, also assigned, also scheduled. It's possible that the sky becomes a model for inevitability. And what if the planet-sized prison feeling is really the sense that even time has bars evenly spaced and you step between them whether you notice or not? Historians still argue whether omen texts reflect widespread popular belief, specialized scholarly practice, political messaging, or a blend that shifts depending on the moment and the audience. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty matters. It keeps our solid ground separate from the mist. Now you lean into the mainstream history for a moment. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholarship eventually includes complex mathematical and observational methods, especially in later periods, and that this tradition influences broader developments in astronomy and calendrics. The evidence we do have points to an impressive commitment to recording, comparing, and predicting. That is documented in the general shape of the tradition, even if individual details vary across time. This is not a world that ignores the sky. This is a world that watches it like a careful neighbour watches the street. Then you let the interpretation breathe again. One interpretation is that prediction itself can feel like confinement. A careful reading might suggest that when a society believes signs are readable, people begin to treat the future as partially written. It's possible that this reduces panic because it provides a script. But what if it also reduces freedom because it turns uncertainty into a verdict? Not always a harsh verdict, sometimes just a quiet one. A year will be difficult. A king will need caution. A city should make offerings. The language can be soft, but the emotional impact can be heavy. Second light joke, gentle and modern. You know you are truly ancient when your weather app is just a priest pointing at the moon and saying it might rain, and also you should probably apologise to somebody. Now the mystery theory portion enters clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that ancient star knowledge was not discovered slowly, but handed down fully formed as if someone wanted humans to follow a cosmic timetable. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain magnetism because it makes knowledge feel like a message. A fringe idea proposes that the sky in these traditions is not just observed, but designed a kind of clock face built to keep a planet in rhythm, like a prison schedule written in light. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the calmer question underneath is, why does the sky feel authoritative? The answer might be simple. The sky is the biggest repeating thing anyone can see. Repetition feels like rule. A more cautious explanation could be that humans are pattern seekers, and once you can predict an eclipse or a planetary cycle, it feels like you are touching the gears of reality. That feeling can be thrilling. It can also be unsettling because gears suggest machinery, and machinery suggests someone built it. But built by whom? Nature, God, mythic order. Your imagination can offer many answers. The evidence for literal builders remains thin. You lie back on the roof and feel the bricks under your shoulders holding the day's warmth. The fan in your room, if you have one, running becomes the modern echo of a night breeze that moves across reed roofs. You stare up and let a cinematic thought arrive, clearly framed as imagination. What if the stars are not just distant fires, but markers on the inside of a dome? Not a scientific claim, just a mood, the way certain nights make you feel enclosed, even in open air. What if the universe is a room, and the sky is the ceiling, and the calendar is the lock that keeps you moving in circles? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Third light joke, soft as a whisper. If the cosmos really runs on a schedule, somebody somewhere is definitely late, and the moon is silently judging them, which is impressive because the moon does not even have eyebrows. You sit up again and listen to the city below. Somewhere someone is still working, somewhere someone is praying, somewhere someone is simply trying to sleep. Most historians agree that the sky served practical and symbolic roles guiding agriculture and shaping meaning. One interpretation is that celestial order can make life feel pre-scripted, as if the future is being announced in advance. And what if the most prison-like part is not the sky itself, but the way your mind responds to it, turning patterns into decrees, cycles into destiny, and destiny into a corridor you walk down quietly, one measured night at a time. You move toward a structure that rises above the city like a thought that refuses to stay small. Its layered terraces catch the last light of day, and the bricks glow softly as if they're storing the sun, the way your skin stores warmth after a long walk. Archaeology suggests that monumental temple architecture, including ziggurat-like platforms in later Mesopotamian contexts, reflects organized labor, concentrated resources, and civic identity. Most historians agree that sacred buildings are not just religious ornaments, but power centers where ritual economy and authority meet in the same courtyard. You stand at the base and look up, and the stairs do something strange to your mind. They pull your attention upward in a way that feels automatic, like your eyes are being guided. What's broadly accepted is that these elevated spaces create a physical separation. The sacred is higher, the ordinary is lower. Solid ground. Architecture shapes behavior. Architecture shapes feeling. One interpretation is that the vertical design becomes a model for a vertical universe, with layers you can't casually cross. A careful reading might suggest that when people build sacred height, they also build sacred hierarchy into the imagination. And what if the planet-sized prison is not a dome, but a stack reality arranged in levels where movement is controlled by status and permission? You climb slowly because you're in second person present, and you're being sleep-friendly, not sprinting like an action hero. Your feet find the worn edges of steps. The air thins just a little, not because you're high, but because you're away from the densest smells of street life. The higher you go, the more you hear wind. The city's noise becomes a muffled texture. Most historians agree that temple complexes involve controlled spaces and specialized personnel, and the evidence we do have points to restricted areas within sacred precincts. A more cautious explanation could be that restriction protects valuables, preserves ritual purity, and maintains order. Still, it's possible that restriction also teaches a lesson: not everyone is meant to go everywhere. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Boundaries can be practical as well as symbolic. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the pattern of restricted access is mainstream enough to stand on as a historical fact, even if the emotional interpretation varies. You reach a landing and glance across the rooftops. The city looks like a woven mat from up here, a tight pattern of walls and courtyards. You can see smoke rising from cooking fires, small and steady, like dots of punctuation in the evening. What's broadly accepted is that these cities are complex ecosystems. Archaeology suggests dense habitation workshops, storage and ritual spaces interlaced. And now you feel how the temple from this height can look like the center of a diagram. One interpretation is that the temple becomes a model of the cosmos. A careful reading might suggest that when you place a sacred house on a platform, you are saying the divine realm is not just elsewhere, it is structured above you. It's possible that this physical model shapes the way myths describe layered worlds, sky above Earth, in the middle, a realm below. And what if the planet-sized prison is not one set of bars but a cosmic floor plan where each level has rules and guards, and the stairs are not just stairs but a controlled passage between worlds? Your first light joke arrives like a small pebble tossed into the quiet. If you've ever climbed stairs to a fancy rooftop bar and realised the drinks cost more because you're higher, congratulations, you understand sacred elevation economics. The view is part of the transaction. You continue upward and notice how the space becomes cleaner, quieter and more curated. Someone has swept. Someone has arranged objects carefully. Someone has decided what belongs here. Most historians agree that ritual involves order repetition and careful handling of offerings. The evidence we do have points to priests and temple workers managing offerings and ceremonies. Solid ground again. And then the interpretation. One interpretation is that ritual order can feel like a rehearsal for cosmic order. A careful reading might suggest that when you participate in ritual, you practice staying within lines, where to stand, when to speak, how to move. It's possible that the temple teaches the body obedience gently like a dance. And what if the prison is not a punishment, but a choreography you learn so early you forget it was taught? Historians still argue whether temples functioned primarily as community anchors that redistributed resources and maintained social stability, or primarily as institutions that concentrated wealth and enforced hierarchy because their roles can shift over time and vary between cities. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty keeps us honest. Now you reach the top area or near it, and you feel the wind more clearly. The sky looks closer, though you know it isn't. That illusion is the whole trick of elevation. You are still on Earth, but your mind feels nearer to above. One interpretation is that this nearness reinforces the sense of a layered universe. A careful reading might suggest that the architecture is a story you can walk on, climb toward the divine, but only by the approved path. It's possible that the approved path itself becomes the point. And what if, for someone who is not allowed to climb the temple height, looks like proof that the world is arranged in tiers and you are expected to remain on your tier? Second light joke, sleepy and polite. The universe's VIP section has always existed. The only thing that changed is the wristband design. Now the mystery theory portion arrives clearly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that monumental temple platforms are not only symbolic but practical components of some ancient cosmic interface, as if the structure is a beacon, a receiver, or a control point connected to larger forces. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for literal machinery is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the calmer question underneath is, why do these buildings feel like connectors between worlds? A more cautious explanation could be that humans build tall, sacred spaces because height feels meaningful, because it separates, because it impresses, because it frames the sky. The building becomes a psychological bridge, not a technological one. Still, you let the cinematic imagination breathe for a moment. What if you stand on the top platform at night? The city below is dim lamps like scattered fireflies. The river is a dark ribbon. The stars are sharp. You feel as if you are in a place where messages might travel not by radio, but by ritual, not by wires, but by belief. And what if the planet-sized prison in this imagined mood is not built by someone else, but reinforced each time a human climbs a sanctioned staircase and accepts that certain heights belong to certain people? Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Now you look at the steps again, and you notice how stairs can be both invitation and limitation. They invite movement upward, but they also define how movement must happen. There's no teleporting, no shortcut, no side door unless you're the kind of person who knows where the side door is. Most historians agree that controlled access is part of temple life, and archaeology suggests that physical layouts shape social behaviour. One interpretation is that the temple's architecture teaches a simple lesson: the world is layered and climbing is conditional. Third Light Joke whispered, so it doesn't wake anybody. The first elevator music was probably just a priest humming, while everyone pretended the climb was spiritually effortless. You descend slightly because standing on the top makes your calves start complaining, and ancient calves did not have foam rollers. You look out one more time and the city feels like a living system with a sacred engine at its centre. Most historians agree that temples anchor civic life. One interpretation is that the temple's layered height becomes a metaphor for a layered universe where authority is embedded in the architecture of reality. And what if, when later readers search for a planet-sized prison, in the old texts the strongest clue isn't a literal cage, but the consistent message of layered access? The world has levels, and the stairs are real, and not everyone gets to climb. You feel the air change the way it changes before a storm. Not because lightning is coming, but because memory is. The river is nearby, and it speaks in that steady, unstoppable voice, the kind that makes you realise how small walls are compared to water. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian flood narratives echo the realities of living in a landscape shaped by unpredictable rivers, and archaeology suggests that flood events, shifting channels, and environmental stress are real factors in southern Mesopotamian life. The evidence we do have points to communities that build, rebuild, and learn to live with a force that can undo months of labour overnight. You watch the river level rise in your imagination, and it is not cinematic horror, just relentless. Water creeps into low places. Mud softens, bricks slump, people shout instructions and carry bundles. This is mainstream reality. Rivers flood, fields drown, storage can be lost. A more cautious explanation could be that flood stories develop from repeated experiences of disaster, preserved and reshaped through generations as myth and warning. Still, one interpretation is that the flood becomes a narrative reset button, a way to explain why the world changes abruptly. A careful reading might suggest that when people tell flood stories, they are not only describing water, they are describing loss of control. And what if the planet-sized prison mood finds a new form here? Not walls, not ledgers, not stairs, but the idea that even if you could escape a system, you cannot escape the environment that keeps pushing you back into dependence. If your survival depends on canals and storage and floods can erase both, you may cling tighter to institutions that promise rebuilding. That's interpretation, not a verdict, but it's possible. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Institutions can form for many reasons, including cooperation, mutual aid, and pragmatic management of risk. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the pattern is plausible. Uncertainty encourages centralized storage, coordination, and ritual explanation. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, like the private feelings of people watching their courtyard fill with water. You step into a shelter as the rain begins. The roof is reed and mud. It smells like wet straw. Someone presses a child close. Someone mutters a prayer. Most historians agree that ritual and myth help people process danger, and the evidence we do have points to offerings and appeals to divine powers during crises. This is solid ground. Humans do this everywhere. You have probably whispered at the universe in your own way, even if your offering was just promising to be nicer if the Wi-Fi comes back. Your first light joke arrives gentle and modern. The ancient flood plan is basically the same as today. Panic carry everything you own at once and then realize you forgot the one thing you actually needed. Now you let the story move into interpretation carefully signposted. One interpretation is that flood myths teach boundaries in a different way. Instead of gates that close, you get a world that closes around you through water. A careful reading might suggest that the flood is a reminder that humans are not fully in charge and that control is conditional. It's possible that this makes the world feel like an enclosure, not because someone built a prison, but because reality itself has limits you can't negotiate with. Historians still argue whether flood narratives preserve memories of particular historical events, long-term environmental patterns, or primarily serve symbolic functions that communicate moral and cosmic order. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is important. It lets us keep solid ground separate from mist, and it prevents the story from turning into a single claim with fake certainty. You watch the city respond. People move to higher ground. They reinforce embankments. They open channels. They stack sand and reeds. Archaeology suggests communities invest heavily in water management, and most historians agree that irrigation and flood control are critical to Mesopotamian life. That's mainstream. But now notice the emotional consequence. One interpretation is that collective danger strengthens collective control. When survival depends on coordinated action, the group becomes more organized and organization can become stricter. It's possible that after disaster, rules harden, measures become more precise, storage becomes more centralized, debt becomes heavier, rations become more controlled. Not because someone is evil, but because fear likes structure. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Many communities respond to crisis with solidarity and generosity too. Still, the possibility is worth holding because it shows how a prison feeling can arise without any villain at all. Now, the mystery theory portion arrives clearly labelled. A popular rumour claims that flood stories encode something hidden, that they are not about water, but about deliberate resets, as if some external power periodically wipes the board clean to keep humanity contained and compliant. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for literal external reset controllers is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a calmer question: why does the reset idea appeal to people? A more cautious explanation could be that when life feels unfair, people want a reason that matches the scale of the pain. A flood destroys so much, it feels like it must be intentional. But nature does not need intent to be devastating. Second light joke, soft and sleepy. If nature had a customer service line, it would be permanently busy and the hold music would just be rain. You shift the focus to the social side of the flood story. Most historians agree that myths can legitimize kingship and institutions by framing leaders as protectors who rebuild and restore order. The evidence we do have points to rulers emphasizing their role in construction and stability. One interpretation is that catastrophe strengthens the narrative of authority, the king, the temple, the city, the gods, all presented as the framework that holds chaos at bay. It's possible that this framework feels like safety and confinement at the same time. Safety because it organizes recovery, confinement because it tightens your dependence. You imagine as gentle imagination a rebuilt wall after a flood, fresh bricks, new plaster, new gates. The city looks cleaner, but the memory of loss lingers in the way people look toward the river. What if that memory becomes a quiet leash, making people accept more rules because they fear what happens without them? Again, that's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is the kind of possibility that keeps the story human rather than sensational. Historians still argue whether the centralization seen in some periods is best explained by environmental pressures, warfare, trade, dynamics, religious ideology, or a blend, and the blend likely shifts over time. There's no full consensus. That's your cue to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Third light joke whispered, after a flood, the first real luxury isn't gold, it's dry socks, and ancient people would absolutely understand that. You step back from the river and let the rain ease in your imagination. The city exhales. The water lowers. People return to routines with the weary determination of anyone who has ever cleaned up after a mess that wasn't their fault. Most historians agree that resilience and rebuilding are recurring realities in river civilizations. One interpretation is that flood narratives, by emphasizing reset and restoration, teach people to accept cycles of loss and control as normal. And what if the planet-sized prison is less a physical enclosure and more a loop, build, lose, rebuild, obey, repeat? Not because someone is pulling strings, but because the landscape itself encourages systems that keep people close, organized, and always ready for the next rise of water. You move into a small dim room where the air smells like clay dust and old smoke, and someone is whispering a word the way you whisper a password when you don't want the room to hear it. A lamp flickers. Shadows wobble on the wall. Most historians agree that in ancient Mesopotamian cultures, Names, rituals, and formal spoken formulas carry real weight, and the evidence we do have points to a world where words are not just descriptions but actions. Archaeology suggests that ritual practice exists alongside administration, and sometimes the two share the same tools: tablets, seals, and trained specialists. You sit on a low stool in your imagination and listen. A person recites something carefully, and the carefulness itself tells you this matters. What's broadly accepted is that ancient societies often treat certain words and names as powerful, especially in religious contexts. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual language creates focused community and emotional stability. Still, one interpretation is that secrecy functions like access control. A careful reading might suggest that if certain names or formulas are restricted to specialists, then knowledge becomes a gate. It's possible that the most effective barriers are not brick, but vocabulary. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Not every ritual is secret, and not every specialist is a gatekeeper by intention. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Yet the pattern is recognizable across many cultures. Specialized words create specialized authority. You watch a priest or ritual specialist, someone trained, someone practiced moving through a sequence. Hands wash, objects are arranged, a phrase is spoken at the exact moment a bowl is lifted. The rhythm is almost hypnotic. Most historians agree that ritual often involves repetition and precision, and the evidence we do have points to formal practices meant to maintain purity, ward off harm, or restore balance. Solid ground. And now the interpretation. One interpretation is that precision becomes a kind of lock. A careful reading might suggest that if you do not know the sequence, you cannot participate fully, and if you cannot participate fully, you are on the outside of the protection it promises. It's possible that ritual creates an inside and an outside just as surely as a city wall does. Your first light joke arrives softly because you can't help it. If you have ever tried to reset your router by pressing the button in exactly the right way for exactly the right number of seconds, you already understand ancient ritual energy. The universe loves instructions, apparently. Now you shift toward the power of names. What's broadly accepted is that names matter in legal and social contexts. Naming identifies, binds, and records. The evidence we do have points to names being written on tablets attached to obligations, ownership, and status. Archaeology suggests a world where identity can be marked by seals and documented in lists. One interpretation is that to be named is to be located in the system. A careful reading might suggest that a name on a tablet can function like a tag. You're linked to a ration, a debt, a household, a job. It's possible that anonymity is a kind of freedom, and documentation is a kind of enclosure. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Documentation can also be protection-proof and stability. Still, the emotional resonance is worth noticing because it connects ritual and bureaucracy in a quiet way. Both depend on exact words. Historians still argue whether the primary function of many ritual texts and practices is practical protection from perceived supernatural threats, social cohesion, political legitimacy, or mix that shifts by context. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty keeps us from making ritual into a single simple thing. You watch as someone presses a seal into clay, and then someone speaks a name aloud. The seal and the name together feel like a double click of reality, one visual, one verbal. Most historians agree that sealing authenticates, and that spoken formulas can sanctify or formalize. The evidence we do have points to people caring deeply about correctness. Now the interpretation. One interpretation is that correctness itself becomes power. A careful reading might suggest that when a society believes the right word opens the right door, language becomes a key. It's possible that life begins to feel like a corridor of doors, and the doors only open if you know what to say. Second Light Joke whispered. The first wrong password error message was probably a priest giving you a look that says, try again but slower, and please stop sweating on the offering. Now the mystery theory portion enters clearly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that ancient rituals and names are not symbolic but technical, like command phrases that interact with reality as if reality were a programmed system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for literal code is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still point us toward a calmer insight. People experience language as powerful because language shapes attention behavior and group agreement. A more cautious explanation could be that ritual works partly through psychology and social reinforcement, and partly through the deep human comfort of doing something in the face of uncertainty. But you let a cinematic what-if mood drift in anyway, because the story asks for it, and you label it as imagination. What if some ancient phrases feel like passwords because they were meant to? Not passwords for computers, but passwords for belonging. Say the words and you are inside the circle. Know the name and you are recognized. Follow the sequence and you are protected. Fail to do so and you are outside, not cursed by a villain, but simply excluded by structure. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You listen again and notice something subtle. In many traditions, words don't just describe, they declare. They make a marriage, they make a contract, they make a curse, they make a blessing. Most historians agree that formal speech acts exist in ancient societies, and the evidence we do have points to legal and ritual language doing real work. One interpretation is that speech acts are a kind of social technology. A careful reading might suggest that whoever controls official speech controls the shape of reality in a community. It's possible that this is another way an enclosure forms, not by locking bodies, but by locking meanings. Historians still argue whether access to literacy and ritual expertise was broadly distributed among different social groups or concentrated among elites and specialists, and the answer likely varies by place and period. There's no full consensus. The uncertainty itself is a clue. The more valuable the skill, the more contested its distribution tends to be. Third Light Joke. soft as a breath. In the ancient world, networking is literally knowing the right names. And honestly, nothing has changed except now the names are on business cards instead of clay. You stand and step back into the night air. The stars are out again, steady and quiet. The city hums at a low level, and somewhere a dog sighs because even dogs get tired of history. You carry the section's idea with you. The world is made of boundaries, and some boundaries are built from words. Most historians agree that ritual and naming are central to Mesopotamian life. One interpretation is that secrecy and correctness can function like access control, shaping who belongs where. And what if the planet-sized prison is not a physical cage, but a reality where doors are everywhere, and the only keys are names you may never be taught? You walk into a small workshop where the light falls in a thin stripe across a table, and in that stripe you see something that feels almost intimate, a cylinder seal resting in someone's palm. It is small, but it carries an entire world carved into it. Tiny figures, animals, symbols, lines, all packed into a surface meant to be rolled across clay. Archaeology suggests that cylinder seals are widespread in Mesopotamian contexts and serve as markers of identity, authority, and ownership. Most historians agree they function like signatures, but with artwork, status, and story all mixed in. The craftsperson turns the seal slowly, admiring the carving. You can almost hear the faint scratch of stone tools the patience required to make such fine lines. The evidence we do have points to seals being used on jars, doors, tablets, and storage spaces. Solid ground seals are real and they matter. Now the interpretation. One interpretation is that a seal is more than a signature. It is a portable boundary. A careful reading might suggest that wherever you roll it, you redraw the line between mine and not mine, official and unofficial, allowed and not allowed. It's possible that identity becomes something that can be stamped. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Seals can provide security and clarity, preventing disputes and fraud. Still, the emotional resonance is clear if your access depends on a stamp you do not possess. You learn quickly where you stand. You watch an official come in because officials always find you when you are trying to be quiet. The official takes the seal, presses it into wet clay, sealing a jar, and then sets the jar behind a doorway. Suddenly the jar isn't just food, it's controlled food. The evidence we do have points to sealing being part of securing storerooms and goods. Most historians agree that administrative systems rely on such mechanisms. Solid ground again. And now the prison theme gains a new angle. One interpretation is that the seal makes control invisible. There's no guard standing with a spear. There's just a small line of clay, a design, and the knowledge that breaking it has consequences. It's possible that the seal turns the world into a set of do not tamper labels. Your first light joke arrives softly. The ancient equivalent of a security sticker is way classier because it comes with miniature artwork, and it probably still says the same thing. If this seal is broken, you are in trouble. You step into a storeroom corridor and see doors with clay ceilings pressed at the edge where a cord or latch is secured. This is mainstream enough to be simple seals show whether something was opened. Archaeology suggests this is a practical technique. Now, the interpretation, a careful reading, might suggest that this kind of control changes behaviour even when nobody is watching. It's possible that the seal makes surveillance unnecessary. The boundary is not a person, it's an object that remembers. You feel a small chill, not fear, just recognition, because you have lived the modern version. A camera sign that makes you behave, even if the camera is fake. A tracking-enabled message that changes what you say. A keycard door that reminds you you're not supposed to be in the hallway. You don't need anyone to yell. The object does it quietly. Historians still argue whether the spread of seals and administrative controls should be interpreted primarily as evidence of efficient organisation and expanding trade, or as evidence of increasingly formalised hierarchy and restricted access, and the truth may depend on the time-place and who you are in the system. There's no full consensus which keeps us from turning the seal into a single symbol with one meaning. Now you shift to the human side who gets a seal. Most historians agree that seals are associated with individuals who have roles, authority, or responsibilities that require authentication. Archaeology suggests varied seal styles and materials that may correlate with status. One interpretation is that seals are social passports. A careful reading might suggest that in a world of controlled storage and recorded transactions, the seal is a key to mobility and power. It's possible that without a seal, you are always the person waiting outside the door. Second Light joke whispered, the ancient ID badge is so stylish that if you wore it today, people would call it artisanal and charge you triple. Now the mystery theory portion arrives carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that certain seal imagery is not symbolic, but literal documentation of cosmic events or hidden structures, and that the designs encode a larger truth about containment control, or even a planet-scale enclosure. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a single hidden code across seal art is thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask a calmer question: why do seals feel so charged to modern eyes? A more cautious explanation could be that seals compress power into a small object, and humans are naturally fascinated by compact power. You pick up a seal in your imagination and roll it across a fresh tablet. The image appears crisp, repeating. It feels like a spell, even though it is also administration. That overlap is the key. One interpretation is that administration often borrows the emotional aura of ritual. A careful reading might suggest that the act of sealing feels sacred because it is irreversible in the moment. The clay takes the impression and holds it. It's possible that the seal becomes a tiny ritual of authority. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not claiming everyone experienced seals as mystical, but it's reasonable to notice that the act is dramatic in a quiet way. Now you let the cinematic what-if mood arrive clearly labelled as imagination. What if the entire planet is like a sealed jar? You can see the contents, you can live among them, but the lid is stamped with an impression you did not make. The stamp doesn't shout. It just sits there saying, this space is governed, this space is owned, this space has rules, not a scientific claim, just an image, a way to feel the metaphor. You breathe out slowly and return to the solid ground. Most historians agree that seals support administration, trade, and governance. Archaeology suggests their widespread use across many contexts. The evidence we do have points to a culture skilled at creating systems of verification. One interpretation is that verification systems create invisible walls. A careful reading might suggest that control can be aesthetic, portable, and quiet. It's possible that the most effective boundaries are the ones that look like art. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of sealing practices reflects growing trust and complexity in trade networks, or growing control and surveillance by institutions, and the likely answer is that it reflects both depending on the situation. There's no full consensus, and that's fine. The world can be complicated without being mysterious on purpose. Third light joke, very soft. If you ever want to feel powerful, don't buy a sports car. Just get a stamp that makes people stop arguing instantly. Humanity is surprisingly stampable. You set the seal down and listen to the room. The city continues outside, busy and warm. Inside the seal sits like a sleeping animal, small and harmless looking, yet capable of closing doors and opening them. You carry the section's clue with you. Identity and authority can be pressed into clay, and that pressed identity can shape where you can go. Most historians agree seals are a key part of Mesopotamian administration. One interpretation is that seals function like portable boundaries, making control quiet and constant. And what if the planet-sized prison is simply the feeling of living inside an official world where even your access is stamped, rolled, and recorded? You step into the mistier part of tonight's path, where the ground is still there, but it's covered in a thin layer of fog that makes everything look more dramatic than it probably is. The city is quieter now, as if even the bricks are listening. Most historians agree that translating and interpreting ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts is complex, and the evidence we do have points to gaps, damaged tablets, shifting meanings over time, and modern disagreements about how best to read certain passages. That is solid ground, and it matters because uncertainty is not a flaw in history, it's part of the honest texture of it. Now you take the outline's promised turn, you enter the territory of the giant enclosure reading, but you enter it carefully with soft disclaimers and a steady hand on the truth ladder. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this: Sumerian texts contain rich imagery of boundaries, gates, seals, decrees, destinies, and layered cosmic spaces. Most historians agree that these motifs appear across myths and rituals, and also connect to real-life urban architecture and administration. The evidence we do have points to a society steeped in threshold language, because thresholds are everywhere in their lived world. That's mainstream enough to anchor you. Now the interpreted layer. One interpretation is that when later readers notice how often these texts talk about being held, assigned, kept sealed, or passing through gates, they start to feel a larger pattern reality as containment. A careful reading might suggest that the themes of restriction are not random, but structural. It's possible that these texts, when viewed as a whole mood rather than a single sentence, can feel like they are describing life as living inside a managed space. And now the fringe safe framing arrives exactly as promised. A fringe idea proposes that ancient Sumerian and Mesopotamian texts preserve hints of a literal planet-sized prison, a cosmic enclosure designed to confine humanity or life on Earth. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a literal physical cage is thin. Still, it persists as a modern reading because it matches the emotional vibe of the motifs: gates in the underworld, seals on storerooms, decrees from divine councils, calendars that feel like schedules, and a world that seems layered with permissions. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You imagine a cinematic possibility, a scholar in a modern room turning a tablet photograph in a soft pool of lamplight, seeing a word that could be translated one way or another. The scholar chooses bind rather than assign, or hold rather than keep, and suddenly the tone shifts. The same clay marks a different emotional colour. This is a real dynamic in translation. Broadly speaking, word choices can shape the mood. That doesn't mean translators are dishonest. It means language is alive and complicated. But it does mean a careful reading might suggest that some modern prison interpretations are born partly from translation choices and partly from the reader's hunger for pattern. Historians still argue whether certain recurring motifs should be read primarily as poetic myth language, as reflections of social institutions, or as fragments of older belief systems that don't map neatly onto later categories. There's no full consensus, and that lack of consensus is exactly what a fringe interpretation tends to use as oxygen. Where the record is incomplete, imagination has room. Now you keep the 70% mainstream balance by grounding the next steps in how ancient texts function. Most historians agree that myths are not newspapers, they are meaning machines. The evidence we do have points to these stories being used in ritual contexts, teaching identity, and the reinforcement of social order. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic confinement themes are moral and existential, not literal. The underworld has gates because death feels final. The gods issue decrees because life feels governed by forces bigger than you. The calendar feels like a schedule because seasons do not ask permission. And yet you allow the fringe reading to stand as a what if, not a conclusion. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if in an ancient imagination that blends physical and symbolic freely, the idea of an enclosure is a way to talk about a real sensation being contained by reality? Not contained by a villain, but by the nature of being human in a system. The planet-sized prison might be metaphor before it is mechanics. Your first light joke arrives because you need humour in the fog. If the world is a prison, it's a weird one because the gift shop is excellent, the sunsets are free, and the management refuses to answer emails. Now you examine one popular shape of the fringe theory carefully and safely. A popular rumour claims that certain divine groups are literal overseers, and that ancient decrees are enforcement protocols. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to people because it makes the world's unfairness feel intentional rather than random. A more cautious explanation could be that humans prefer an explanation with an agent even when the real causes are complex systems, environment, politics, economy, and social hierarchy. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can help you notice how the texts themselves sometimes describe authority as layered and impersonal, like rules that exist beyond any one person. Second Light Joke whispered, "Even if the cosmos has wardens, they clearly didn't design traffic, so their resume has holes." Now you shift to what we can reasonably say without misleading. The evidence we do have points to boundary motifs being central in Sumerian storytelling. One interpretation is that these motifs become a mental model. The universe has borders and you live within them. A careful reading might suggest that when you stack enough motifs, gates, seals, decrees, assign destinies, layered spaces, you get a picture that can be read as containment, at least emotionally. That is suggestive, not conclusive. It might support the idea that ancient people felt life's limits sharply. It does not prove they believed in a literal prison planet. Historians still argue whether modern prison planet readings tell us more about ancient Sumer, or more about modern anxieties, about control, surveillance, and systems. There's no full consensus, and the honest answer is probably a bit of both, depending on the reader. Ancient texts can be mirrors. We look into them, and sometimes we see ourselves. Now you let the cinematic imagination take a fuller breath, clearly labelled. What if you zoom out beyond the city walls and see the world as a set of nested boundaries, riverbanks, canals, city walls, temple precincts, storeroom seals, names on tablets, calendar cycles, underworld gates, divine decrees? Each boundary alone is understandable. Together, they form a pattern that feels like a cage made of layers. Not a cage you can touch, but a cage you can feel, because every path has a checkpoint. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Third Light Joke, soft as a lullaby. If this is a prison, at least, it comes with a complimentary existential question per day, and the supply is unfortunately unlimited. You step out of the fog a little and return to the practical truth ladder. Documented the texts and their motifs exist. Interpreted, the motifs may reflect social and psychological experiences of control. Imagined, the planet-sized prison can be treated as a cinematic metaphor for layered containment. That way, you stay monetization safe and intellectually honest, and you still get the delicious, eerie mood. You breathe slowly. The city is quiet. The stars hang above like fixed points. You do not need to decide what is literal tonight. You only need to hold the puzzle gently. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that unconfirmed space, the fringe reading can remain what it is, a debated interpretation that uses ancient boundary language to tell a modern story about enclosure. You let the night settle into its final soft shape, the way dust settles when nobody's walking through the room anymore. The air feels cooler. The city's sounds thin out until they are just a low, distant hum, like a faraway generator you can barely hear. Most historians agree that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian texts blend mythic imagery with lived realities, and archaeology suggests that what survives to us is partial, scattered, and shaped by time. The evidence we do have points to a world that is both intensely practical and intensely symbolic, where a boundary can be a brick wall one moment and a cosmic rule the next. And now you gather the threads in a way that stays safe, calm, and honest. What's broadly accepted is that these people live inside layered systems, cities with walls and gates, institutions with storerooms and seals, calendars tied to the sky, legal obligations recorded on tablets, rituals that depend on precise words and stories that describe realms above and below with their own rules. That's the documented ground you can stand on without wobbling. One interpretation is that when you place all those layers side by side, you begin to feel a pattern of containment. A careful reading might suggest that ancient life, at least in certain contexts, can feel like moving through nested permissions to work, to eat, to worship, to trade, to cross a threshold, to be recognized, to be protected. It's possible that this pattern is why modern readers sometimes reach for the phrase planet-sized prison, not because the tablets plainly declare it, but because the mood of boundaries is everywhere. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The same layers can also be read as survival technology. A more cautious explanation could be that walls, rations, calendars, contracts, and rituals arise because complex communities need coordination and meaning. Coordination prevents chaos. Meaning prevents despair. A city is a system, yes, but it is also a shelter. Historians still argue whether the strongest driver behind these systems is environmental necessity, political ambition, religious ideology, economic complexity, or shifting blend of all four. And the blend changes from city to city and century to century. There's no full consensus, and that lack of consensus is not a problem. It's a reminder that the ancient world is not a single story. Now the fringe-safe framing returns one last time gently, like a candle being set on a table. A fringe idea proposes that Sumerian texts hint at a literal planet-sized prison, an enclosure built or maintained by hidden forces. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a literal physical cage remains thin. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can work as a cinematic lens. It asks, what if the story is pointing at something else? What if the biggest prison is not made of stone but of structure? And the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can confirm that boundaries exist in the material record. We can confirm that myths describe gates and decrees. We cannot confirm a literal planet enclosure from the surviving evidence. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Your sleepy brain offers a final trio of light jokes spaced like small stepping stones. First, if the universe is a prison, it's wildly underfunded because the roads are terrible and the customer service is non-existent. Second, The cosmic rulebook is definitely written in tiny print on a clay tablet, and you agree to it by existing. Third, the only real contraband is peace and quiet, which is why you're here listening at night. Now, you let the narrative settle into its most grounded takeaway. Most historians agree that Sumerian texts are among the earliest large bodies of written material we have, and archaeology suggests writing begins in administration before expanding into myth and literature. The evidence we do have points to a society inventing ways to make life legible: lists, contracts, seals, calendars, rituals, and stories. One interpretation is that legibility can feel like control, because once you can be counted, you can be managed. It's possible that the earliest prison feeling is simply the moment your life becomes an entry in someone else's record. But there is another interpretation that is gentler. A careful reading might suggest that the same tools that can constrain can also protect. A tablet can enforce a debt, yes, but it can also preserve a promise. A seal can lock a door, yes, but it can also prevent theft. A calendar can feel like a schedule, yes, but it can also keep a community together through seasons. A ritual can gatekeep, yes, but it can also soothe fear and create belonging. It's possible that the world is not a prison or a paradise, but a layered house built by humans trying to survive. Historians still argue whether the emotional experience of ancient systems was primarily heavy or primarily normal, because normal can include hardship without feeling like injustice. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty invites humility. It also invites you here in the dark to choose how you hold the story. Now the promised wind down begins slower, softer, longer in breath, as if the whole city is exhaling, and you are exhaling with it. You imagine the clay tablets again, not as alarms, not as warnings, but as quiet objects that outlived their makers. A tablet sits on a shelf in a storeroom, and the lamplight makes the wedge marks gleam like tiny footprints. Somewhere beyond that shelf, the river continues to move, and it does not remember the names written on clay. Somewhere above, the stars continue to appear, and they do not care which king was praised last year. The world keeps going steady and indifferent, and yet humans keep leaving little marks of meaning behind, hoping the marks will hold. You let your attention drift over the layers, the gate that closes with a dull wooden sound, the seal pressed into wet clay, the measured grain poured into a jar, the careful name spoken in a ritual, the slow climb of steps toward a higher platform, the dark story of a realm below with rules and thresholds, the sky that repeats its patterns night after night. None of these layers needs to be a literal cosmic cage to feel powerful. The feeling can be enough. The metaphor can be enough. The question can be enough. And in the quiet, you allow yourself to rest inside uncertainty without needing to solve it. You remind yourself gently that you are safe where you are. You are not trapped in an ancient city. You are not being counted by a scribe. You are not standing at a gate. You are listening, breathing, letting your mind wander through old images, and then return to the present like a boat drifting out and then back to shore. If you want to carry one calming thought to sleep, let it be. Even the most complex systems, Even the heaviest stories become small and soft at night when you stop fighting them. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and you don't have to confirm anything tonight. You can simply let the mist stay mist, let the solid ground stay solid, and let your thoughts slow down like footsteps in sand. Your breathing eases. The fan hum, the distant city hum, the imagined river hum, all blend into one steady sound. And the last image is simple, a clay tablet cooling in the night air, holding its marks without demanding anything from you.